Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Sports Psych Show. Now this week I'm speaking to journalist and author Sam Walker, and I'm going to let Sam introduce himself, but he's written an awesome book called The Captain Class, which has been hugely popular over the last couple of years, and it's going to be the subject of our chat today. To let you know, he's also written another book, Fantasyland, which is a best-selling account of his attempt to win America's top fantasy baseball expert competition, of which he's actually won a couple of times before, and I do want to know how he's done that. So perhaps after he's introduced himself...
I would too.
Yeah.
Well, in addition to being an author, I've worked for the Wall Street Journal for about 20 years, and I was a sports writer for about half that time, and then I was the editor and the founding editor of the sports section, which is in the paper now, and I have gone on to do other things, and now I am a columnist. I write a column about leadership for the Wall Street Journal, so that's my sort of primary thing. I also, after the book Captain Class came out, I do a lot of speaking and consulting with teams and companies about building better leadership culture, so I do some of that as well.
And I think that's going to be great because you were telling me off air there that you've been doing some work with the Chicago Bears, actually helping them put into practice some of the principles, some of the ideas from the Captain Class. So that's good. We can work together here to kind of take the theory and talk about how we might put that into practice, which is brilliant. And I think there's just so much rich material in this book, Sam, that I come across on a day-to-day basis. There are so many times that the hair on the back of my head kind of grew, which suggests that I'm a really sad man. I'm so into this stuff.
I am too, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because it's essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's a leadership book, but it's taken from a captain's perspective, and I like the way you kind of lay out evidence that you try to demonstrate that a captain's leadership is not just enormously important, but it's perhaps the deciding factor when it comes to a team's success, which I think it's so difficult to, having striven to do this myself, write a book on something a bit different and taking a different approach, which I don't know, I think that's a different approach here, that it's the captain's leadership that actually can trump so many other different factors. So what brought you down, or what took you down this path, and how did you come across this idea of the captain's leadership?
Well, I have to start by saying I never thought I would wind up here. I didn't set out to write about leadership or captains. I didn't even imagine that that's where I would end up. So I just, over the years, working for the Journal, I had a strange job in that I didn't really cover one sport or one team. My job was really to cover the big events and to cover, the Super Bowl and the World Cup and the Olympics and the World Series. So the thing that I really developed a specialty in was great teams, and that's what I spent most of my time covering. And I'd see these teams at the height of their power, and I would always wonder what it was that made them exceptional, because it wasn't always obvious. It wasn't always a talent or coaching. It seemed to be some intangible thing, some connection between the players that made them great. So that was just a curiosity that had always stuck with me, and I started to think, all right, well, why don't I try to actually investigate this and see if there is something that they all share in common? And that, sounds simple. And I thought, I'll write a column for the Journal, write 900 words, it'll take me a week or two to do the research, and that was 12 years ago. So it was just the biggest rabbit hole I've ever been down. And, it started with... I realized I started looking around. I just Googled the greatest teams of all time, and I looked at every list that's ever been published by anyone, and I realized that most of them were totally subjective, and others were just kind of myopic in that they covered one sport or one country, or they were very heavily biased by the sports that are popular in one place. So I realized no one had ever done this. No one had ever tried to say, I'm going to do a really rigorous, objective, empirical study to find the best teams of all time. And that was part one, and it was just an immense undertaking, not only just to define what a team is, because, is an ice dancing team a team? Is a boxing team?
Is the Ryder Cup a team?
Right, exactly. Yeah. What is a team? So I had to define that, and then once I'd done that, then I had to ask the other question, which is, what is greatness? What is greatness, and how do you define it? And there's no magic algorithm or statistic that you can use, because sports are so different and they value different things. So success varies depending on the code you're talking about. So, I really had to come up with my own philosophy of greatness. And for me, there were two pieces to it. I mean, teams had to have competed at the absolute highest level of that sport against the best competition in the world, and they had to have done something unique to their sport, whether it was in terms of the number of titles won or just the longevity of their winning ways. And but really the thing I think that differentiates my work and really what the research really talks about is sustaining it. Because, I just decided, look, a lot of these teams that win a championship or two, or, luck plays a role. Sometimes you can't really say that it's about the team's culture. So I set a minimum of 4 years that a team had to have dominated their sport for at least 4 years in order to qualify. And that really narrowed the list down a lot, because there's very few teams that are able to build a culture of winning that is that they can replicate and that can sustain itself even when the people and the players change. So that's where I kind of started, and after I put that list together, then that began the next great adventure, which is, okay, what do these teams have in common?
And that's where the captain sort of spills out in terms of being quite prominent in their role.
To my great surprise and shock, yeah, no, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I started in the obvious place, which was talent. Maybe they just had superior talent. I quickly realized that the 17 teams that I identified as these freak teams, the greatest teams ever, talent was there, but often not superior. There's no way you could argue on paper that they had the best talent. And so I moved on from that to tactics, and I thought maybe tactical brilliance was the secret. And some of the teams were tactically brilliant. Barcelona, in the 2000s, great tactically. Some of them were not. Some of them were very conservative and unremarkable in their tactics. So it wasn't that. And I really thought it might be money or resources. That didn't pan out. And the big one was coaching. I think we're all conditioned to think that culture, a dynasty, all of that really comes down to the coach or the manager. And that, to my incredible surprise, was not even close. I mean, most of these teams had coaches who, at the beginning of their great streaks of dominance, had been fired from their previous job, or had a losing career record, or had very little experience or no experience. And some of these teams actually changed coaches and kept winning. So it's not that coaches aren't important, or talent isn't important, or money's not important, but it wasn't that one thing that bound them all together. And in the end, I saw this pattern kind of early, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but I never really took it seriously. I noticed that every single one of these teams, you could look at their streak, the beginning and the end of it, and you could overlap that with the arrival and departure of one player. And that player in every single case was the team leader or the captain. And it happened over and over again, to the point where I would find some Uruguayan team from the 40s that was amazing, and I would start researching them, and I would find a captain, and that captain showed up, and that captain left, and that sort of was the end of their winning ways. And I just saw this over and over, not just for those 17 teams, but for the other 120 some odd teams that were very close. So that pattern was so obvious, slap your forehead obvious, that I realized I had to look into it. But I did so with maximum skepticism, and I just didn't think that the internal leadership of the players could matter that much. But over time, all of my skepticism, all the things I thought were standing in the way of that being the case, just fell away. And in the end, I realized that this is the best way I can put it. I think people say to me, well, so you just get a good captain and you have a great team. No, absolutely not. I mean, a great team needs many things. It needs talent. It needs a good coach. It needs all these things. But the one thing it has to have is a certain kind of leader. And it's almost like the verb in a sentence. I mean, that's my best analogy for it. It's like a great sentence. The reason it's great, it's probably the nouns, the adjectives, the punctuation, something else. is what makes it shiny and exceptional. It's what we think about it when we think about its greatness. The verb may be the last thing you notice. But without that verb, it's not a sentence. It's just a collection of things. It doesn't have any forward motion. And that's the role of the captain, I found. It's not about being the obvious thing, about putting the team on your back and carrying it to victory. It's really about doing all the sort of labor behind the scenes, the necessary labor, the grunt work, and caring really about the entire structure more than yourself. And that's really what they were. They were these verbs, and oftentimes they were very unassuming, and you wouldn't even notice them if you weren't looking for them.
It's essentially leadership that whispers, isn't it? And,
yes.
and I think that, just going back to some of the things you said there as I was reading the book, I mean, this is almost like a mini paradigm shift in my own mind. It was just like you said you started to write it with skepticism. As I started to read, I was kind of in and out of skepticism. I mean, I think, which is a good thing. I think that's good writing. That's where you want to be. I think I always, when I deliver to audience, I say, look, I'm going to present in a very convincing way here, but I'd like you to have some skepticism and don't just say, oh, I believe you. But going back to you presenting your argument in the book, you talk about the notions that people have about successful teams, and you talk about the greatest of all time. Is it the greatest of all time? And you sort of present arguments around, well, it's not a team that has the greatest of all time. Is it the talent? Is it the money? That kind of deep pocket theory, and you present that convincing argument that it's not. And then you get around to coaches and coaching, and I'm so passionate about coaching, and I'm like, Sam, you've gone a step too far here. The coaching is really, really important. And I think you provide a really compelling argument as to why it's not the coaches, that actually there's not the evidence there that suggests they have as much impact as some people think. And I did write down in my notes, in big block capitals, but is it an interaction between everything? And I think you're kind of saying, well, there's an interaction, but we really underestimate that quiet leadership value that captains bring to the table. It's
true. It's very awkward for me because I talk to a lot of coaches. I was just in a room full of coaches this week, and I dropped this on them, and you can see them scratching their heads. But when I say, what I found is that coaches are crucial and they're incredibly important people inside a team. But they're important in a way that we don't completely understand. And I think we tend to put too much of the outcome on them, and we tend to blame them or praise them depending on the results. But I think what we're missing is the real value of coaching. And this is the first thing I looked into because it was such a surprise to me. I went and Vince Lombardi, in the U.S. is really considered the greatest coach of all time, NFL coach. He's sort of the Alex Ferguson, of the NFL. And I went and found his former captain, who's now in his 80s, from their really great streak, and I talked to him about this because I was trying to understand how it was possible that Vince Lombardi wasn't necessarily the engine that made that team work. And what I learned was that he was exactly one of these captains, had all the same characteristics. But what he put me onto was this idea of partnership. And that was what really struck me, because they were incredibly like-minded people with this incredible hunger to prove themselves. And he talked a lot about how they played off of each other and also how they interacted. And I went back and looked at all of these great teams, and I realized that this is a pattern that repeats itself all the time. The great coaches of these incredible dynasties always had, if they stayed in their job for a long time, they had a very close relationship with their captain. I'm talking about Alex Ferguson and Roy Keane before it all went bad. I'm talking about Bill Belichick and Tom Brady of the New England Patriots. And in the NBA, it's Greg Popovich and Tim Duncan. You see this over and over again in these teams. And what I realized was that is the key. It's the key to being a great coach, being a great manager, is having a relationship with your captain, which is more of a peer-to-peer thing. It's not a hierarchical boss employee. I mean, they would fight. They would argue. They were able to have heated arguments, but always about the task at hand. It never got personal, and they respected each other. There was often great affection between them, but they were able to fight and fight. And sometimes the manager would back off and let the captain have their way, and sometimes the captain would just carry out orders. And it was that synergy that I think was so important to those teams sustaining their edge and to not being complacent and to continuing the intensity that allowed them to sustain excellence. And again, look, I want to make very clear, you can win a championship with many different styles. And there are coaches and managers who are, I think, the primary engine for a team that wins something. But we're talking about sustaining it. We're talking about a culture. And in order to have a culture of winning that transcends any one person, I think you have to have that partnership.
No, look, I completely agree. And I love that term partnership, because I'm always talking with coaches about co-creating solutions with players. And as you were speaking there, I was reflecting back on a fairly prominent coach I worked with here in England who had worked with Sir Alex Ferguson many years ago. And one thing he said to me was, you know what, Dan, the genius of Sir Alex Ferguson was that he knew what players to give some rope to, because he knew that those players were natural leaders and they would do a lot of the grunt work for him in terms of leadership. So in many respects, he kind of partnered up with those players to go and do those things.
Alex Ferguson did more to really help me believe this theory than almost anyone. I mean, he understands this in this intuitive level. I don't think people talk about it enough. It's such a fundamental part of why he was so great. And he said something that just surprised me. I'd seen with my own eyes, but never really put together. I mean, you look at a lot of managers in European football now, and you see the way they jump up and down, and they're gesticulating on the sidelines, and they're running around looking like they're trying to participate in the game. And, Ferguson laughed at this. He thought, first of all, what are they doing? And second of all, if the players can hear you, you're just distracting them. I mean, they can't hear you most of the time, and they're not going to, understand what you're trying to tell them. And he would sit in the dugout with his arms folded across his chest, and sometimes it looked like he was going to nod off. And he said that in his view, his job, he was on top of every single detail, every second of training, everything that happened inside the dressing room, every aspect of the team and how it traveled and how it prepared and all of its rituals, everything. That was his domain. But once the match began, he believed that it was up to the captain of the team to execute the strategy, and that's where his influence ended. And for one of the great managers of all time to basically say, I was a proxy, during the match is amazing, and it's something that no one seems to want to absorb. But
you know what, Sam, and it matches up with the research literature on effective coaching and effective management, and that's that. It's important to be an autonomy supportive coach rather than being this overbearing controlled coach. And in that respect, I think Gareth Southgate is a great model, a great example from last year, 2018 World Cup. And I would use the term servant leadership, being a servant leader. And I think I would relate that to, I love this term that you use for captains as being the glue guys, the glue people. And I think servant leaders, autonomy supportive coaches, your Sir Alex Ferguson's, your Vince Lombardi's, etc. Their servant leadership enables the captains to become the glue guys or the glue girls.
Exactly. No, and I love that you mentioned Southgate, because I think what he did with that team was obviously very impressive, and I think I've read a lot of pieces people have written about how this is kind of a new paradigm for leadership. And it's funny to me because Southgate read the book, and I know he spent a lot of time agonizing about the captaincy and thinking very hard about how to do it and who was the right person. And I think he did well. I think Kane was the right choice. I think he. I don't think he had necessarily a natural kind of elite leader on that team who fit the profile that I described. I think Eric Dyer, is very close, and I think he. But he had a situation there where he wasn't going to be on the pitch all the time, and I think Harry Kane was the right decision. But that sort of consideration, and I think what I've noticed in working with the Bears and some of the other teams and sporting outfits that I've talked to about the book is that there is throughout management, not just the coach or the manager, but even the executives higher up, there is a certain curiosity and a certain interest in culture, in the intangibles, the sort of chemistry of the team, and all these things that you can't measure. And I think a lot of people avoid that for that reason, because it's something that you can't understand. But I think the coaches and the managers that are having great success now are the ones who understand it and are willing to wade in and try to think about the framework. I mean, that's really the job of a coach or a manager, is to create a framework, to create rituals around the team that allow it this sort of chemistry and leadership culture to grow and prosper. And part of that, yes, is allowing that the players to have their own space. My favorite example is just Pep Guardiola, who obviously, one of the great managers, but everyone forgets that when he took over that incredible Barcelona team, he had coached the B team for 1 year.
A minimal amount of time, yeah.
And he had played with a lot of these players, and we know that can be very awkward and difficult for a manager when they've actually played with some of their charges. And but what he did, I thought, was really interesting, and he still does this today, which is he shifted training from the morning to the afternoon. And the reason he did that was because he wanted the players to have dinner together. He wanted them to be able to form deeper bonds, and not just disperse at noon and go their separate ways. But the other thing I thought was really fascinating, and such a credit to him, was he never went in the dressing room. He'd played with some of these guys. They were his friends. But he understood that the team needs its space, and that he needs to be something a bit of arm's length from the team, because there has to be a separate realm there that they can develop their own leadership and their own chemistry and traditions and rituals. And I think that understanding explains a lot of why that Barcelona team had such incredible success.
I certainly agree with you that the term partnership is a really relevant one, coach and captain partnership, and you describe those great captains as the glue guys or the glue girls, and the crucial component that perhaps puts everything together for a captain. It's interpersonal skills. That's what you describe their skill set as, which I love you for, because I'm so heavily invested in psychosocial coaching. I talk to coaches about being a psychosocial coach. So I just am so passionate about interpersonal skills. But you talk about glue guys or glue girls. You give a description of them, and you talk about how the talented captains that you write about, they lacked superstar talent, they were not fond of the spotlight, they didn't lead in a traditional sense, they weren't angels, they did divisive things, they weren't your usual suspects, as in the very famous players. No one ever singled the captain out of these teams as the team's driving force, and they weren't necessarily the primary leader. So I just think there's so many little interesting dynamics there about the whether you call them the personality characteristics of those glue guys. There's so many little intricate details there.
Yeah, it's such an interesting portrait, because I saw all the pieces and the patterns and found the patterns of behavior between them, and but they weren't the things that I would have expected to matter in a leader. It weren't the things I would have chosen. So, there was really three pieces to this. I mean, the first piece was how they what they projected. I should preface this by saying, God-given talent, ability, charisma, anything that we come out of the womb with, didn't matter. It's not that those things aren't good to have. It's just that the behavior, all the things they did that helped their teams, the traits they had in common were really about behavior, about the choices they would make in different situations. And there were three parts to this. The first is just their general, the way they played. And Carlos Puyol was a great example of this in that they were relentless. I mean, they just played at one tempo. And it didn't matter if they were up by 10 goals, down by 20. I mean, it did not matter. They had the same speed in competition, which was just flat out. Never wanted to come out. And that seriousness of purpose and that intense focus was always there. So they were relentless. They were also incredibly tough. I mean, they just played through, a heart attack, a broken foot, a fractured skull. Buck Shelford played for 20 minutes with a torn scrotum, in a match against France. They had that toughness. They also had this emotional control, which was unbelievable. I mean, the ability to use passion and emotion when it helped the team, but to know when it had crossed the line into hurting the team, and to be able to shut that down, and to be able to play through incredible personal tragedy as well. So those three things, relentlessness, toughness, emotional control, what I realize is that they're all contagious, highly contagious inside a team. And if a leader does them, others will model that behavior, and the whole team gets better incrementally in ways that you can't really see. And those are positive contagious behaviors. There's some contagious behaviors that are negative, like anger, frustration. They never went there. They only used the positive ones. So that was part of it. The second part of being a glue guy is the way you approach your team. It's that servant leadership. And that was the thing that confused me so much, because they were often role players. They were often, in football, they were usually central defenders. They were usually people who rarely scored or did anything dazzling at all. They were more prone to lay off the ball immediately. I mean, Didier Deschamps was a great example of this. I mean, he laid off 10 balls, 9 of them to Zidane, immediately. He never tried to do anything himself. And that servant mentality. So what I realized over time was that these captains cared more about the collective result than they cared about themselves. Genuinely. They didn't want the spotlight. They didn't like being singled out from their team. They weren't in it for ego. They were in it for the team's success. All of their ego was wrapped up in that. And so they would do anything. I mean, they would change positions, dispositions, whatever had to be done. Any thankless task that they would never get credit for, they would immediately do to help the team. And by doing that, they developed this credibility with their teammates. And because their teammates understood very quickly what they were about. And so when they were vocal, and they were very vocal in competition, it really meant something. Everyone knew that they were talking really on behalf of the team and not themselves, and that's very powerful. It gave them a lot of credibility, and it made them leaders, and they were able to kind of lead the team from the back, both by the way they played and distributed the ball, but also because people understood that they were talking on behalf of the collective group and not themselves. But the third part to me was the biggest shock, which is not one of these captains, not one of them likes giving speeches. I mean, we think of the speech, the pregame speech, we think of that as like, of course that's what you do. You practice in the mirror, for God's sakes. You've got to get it right. None of them did. In fact, Puyol told me that he never once in his entire career ever addressed the entire team. Never once. Never, just didn't think it was important. They thought it was a little corny, didn't think he was good at it, and just never did it. The way they communicated was very interesting, and they all had the same pattern, which is they were very quiet. They could be very quiet in public, but inside the team confines, they were vocal, and they had this ability. It's a rare ability some people have. It's a form of emotional intelligence, whatever that is, but it's this ability to approach anyone, to understand people, and to be able to figure them out. And everyone was comfortable being approached by them, and they were comfortable approaching everyone. And they would not have speeches to the group. They would pull people aside individually, and they would have these very intense interactions where they would talk as much as they listened. And they would use gestures and body language, this very intense form of communication one-on-one. And that's how they reached their teammates. And that was that was brilliant, and the reason it was brilliant was because nothing ever festered. No problems, no difficulties inside the team ever festered, because the captain would deal with it immediately and would pull that person aside, and they would discuss it, and the person would feel heard and feel as if they'd had their say. It wasn't it wasn't just yelling. It wasn't recriminations. It was, let's discuss this and let's move on from it and learn from it. And that's the style it works. And, you watch a team and you walk inside a team and you think the leader is the person who has that presence and that everyone listens when they talk and they have this sort of commanding authority about them. But that is not the model that sustains greatness. It's completely different. It's the person who's never going to stand in front of the team and an opine. It's a person who's quietly circulating around the room talking to everyone. And that just completely turned over all my prejudices and assumptions about leadership.
Well, you brilliantly described, there's 7 traits of leadership that you talk about in the book, and this being the Sports Psych show, over the last 20 minutes or so, I'd like to unpack a few of those ideas, because you've given us a wonderful overview there, and I think I'm just conscious of some of the coaches listening in and how they'd like some specific ideas and advice. And what I love about what you've done in this book, Sam, is to produce some stories and then produce some of the scientific evidence behind this. And that first trait of leadership, and you mentioned it right at the very beginning of your narrative there, which is that doggedness and focus in competition. That word relentless, I love that word relentless. I'm often texting my clients about being relentless. I just think it's such a strong, emotive word. But what's interesting is you talk about the science behind mastery orientation. So you refer to the work by, world famous now, Professor Carol Dweck from Stanford University, and actually a way to becoming relentless is to be mastery oriented rather than being overly focused and overly judgmental about performance and outcomes, is to fix the mind on that mastery orientation, having little learning goals, being focused on the things that you can control, and having a narrative, having a language towards, I can improve, I'm just not I haven't reached my goal yet, the power of yet, I can get there, I've just got to keep going. Right, no, and that's something that is hard to identify in people, but it's so crucial in a team setting because, a lot of our ideas about personal performance and achievement are really based on individual pursuits and individual sports, and they're so different because what works for a golfer, a tennis player, a virtuoso performer in a symphony, it's not what works in a team setting. What you need in a team setting is a certain kind of person who really genuinely first cares about the group's performance more than anything else, but also does not care about outside perception. And that's such a big thing because, a lot of athletes, especially at this level, they've always been the best person on the field, over and over through their whole youth. And then they get to this level and they're not, and they realize that there are people that are better than they are. And I think for some people, that's kind of the end of their ability to function because they think, I'm just not good enough. I'm just not, this is just above my, they think about the way that their performance reflects on them. But people who have that mastery orientation like these captains, it's funny, they almost their expectation is that things are going to go well. And that's their real expectation. And they don't look at failure and think, we're not good enough. They think, look at failure and think this isn't the right strategy. We need to try something else. This isn't working, so we need to move on. And there's a calmness there. And they're not the ones who are going to be partying for months after a victory because they kind of expect that. I think they're often muted in their celebration. But we got to find these people because what they do, especially in sports, is the thing that I've found in talking to teams, and I've realized that one of the things that coaches can do and don't do enough is looking at the moments when leadership really matters. Now, I think there's a tendency, whether it's in sports or business or really any field, to look at the triumphs.
the things that you did where you really like just achieved something miraculous in a moment, and to look at that and say, this is my leader, this is who provided the leadership in that moment. The thing is, that's not important. I mean, if you want to sustain excellence, then the moments that really matter are the ones where it all should have fallen apart. And it might have been a loss. It might have been a bad situation that you barely escaped. But those moments when you avert disaster, that's when leadership shows up. What I tried to show in the book was that these leaders were often invisible, but when they showed up and when they brought these traits to bear was in those moments when they faced extreme adversity, when it all could have gone wrong. And that's when leadership shows up. So in a way, what I would recommend is look at that moment. Even if it was a bad match, even if it didn't like the outcome, if you averted disaster and you kept your team together and survived, that's where you'll see the leaders. Well, and if you do a forensic analysis of those moments, and you will see who's actually doing the leadership work.
Well, talking about forensic analysis is interesting because you use Carlos Puyol, the Barcelona captain, in your book as an example. And there's a wonderful clip on YouTube that I saw of Carlos Puyol. Basically, what had happened is some kind of rocket or something had been thrown onto the pitch and they'd hit one.
It was
of the
a lighter.
players.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it was like
it was
this
PK,
player.
Yeah.
This player. Okay, PK. Well done. You've identified this player. So
I have
PK,
that clip. I love that clip.
PK's picked it up and is berating, either talking to himself or talking to the referee and everybody around him. And this isn't to have a go at PK, who's an incredible player, but quite naturally, it's hurt him. So his instinct is, what is this? This is terrible. And Puyol's picked it, taken it off of him, thrown it away. And it's to me, and it's look, I mean. It's not for me to say what Barcelona should or shouldn't do, but that is a clip I would be showing players because that is an example of a tiny, tiny thing that a captain can do that is going to sit of a mastery orientation because there was no ego, there was nothing else. It was nothing else that was important to Puyol other than we get on to defending this corner or whatever it is they were doing. And it was just a classic piece of captain's leadership.
I love that. I love that clip. I have a whole reel that I use in speeches of Puyol in action, and there's several things like that he did. It's amazing. So he had this mentality that if it's not helping us win, if it's not helping us, it's not important and it needs to go away. And, this fan hit PK in the head with the lighter, and PK's holding it up to the referee saying, with his pain expression, like, what the hell is this? And Puyol just comes over like his nanny and snatches it out of his hand and throws it off to the sidelines and pushes him into the right position. And there's another clip that I love of him doing. Some of his teammates, I think they were beating Malaga, 10-0. I mean, it was a beating. And two of his teammates were doing a little dance that they had choreographed, and he ran over and pushed them away. He's like, stop that. And his teammates would always say that even if they were just beating some team senseless, he's running around like it's the Champions League final. I mean, he just had one level of intensity, and he was completely in the moment always. And PK always said that their partnership really worked because he was constantly riding him to stay focused. That was PK's challenge. And he would say, sometimes he would hear Puyol saying, Jerry, Jerry, Jerry. He'd turn around and say, what? And he's like, nothing, just making sure you're paying attention. And it's so classic. It's that all in mentality. And that's what mastery orientation looks like. It's not something we see very often.
Now, interesting. I mean, this is a neat little segue to your second trait, which is sort of performing on the edge of the rules. And when I think about Puyol, I think about an aggressive player. And what I love about this chapter is that you define appropriate aggression for sport and sporting captains, and you lend from the research by Arnold Buss, who's I think he was an evolutionary psychologist. I might be wrong there, but he differentiates between aggression that is hostile to hurt somebody and aggression to achieve a goal. And I love that because the years I've been involved in high competitive sport or high performance sport, I was a golfer, as I said to you off air, and even though golf is regarded as this passive, genteel sport. Reality is, Sam, is that the best golfers in the world are really aggressive with their play, not just strategically, but mentally. You have to stand on that first tee and have an aggressive attitude. But it's not to hurt somebody. It's to achieve a goal. So if we go back to Puyol, he's aggressive in, I really want to achieve this goal. Of mastery orientation, yes, but that lends itself to directed towards performing and winning.
It's true, and that aggression piece was so hard. It's one of the biggest things I think that holds teams back and really hurts them, because if you pull really far back on this, because I had to go way back to really get a handle on this, and there's two things that I think you need to remember, which is, first of all, aggression as it was first defined, really by Freud, this idea that aggressive behavior was negative. It was a negative impulse, which was then, balanced by loving, creative impulse. So the idea was that it was always a bad, a black mark, aggression. And I think we've evolved over time, and psychology has evolved to the point where we understand exactly what you said, which is there is aggression that is meant to hurt someone, and that is always toxic if the intent is to harm or injure. But there's another sort of aggression which is more like assertiveness. It's more like nothing's going to get in the way of this goal that we want to achieve. If someone gets hurt in the process, well, fine, we're trying to achieve a goal. Now, that's not uniformly positive, but here's the thing about sports, that the real problem is that, the roots of organized team sport really are tied up in this sort of code of sportsmanship and honor and gentility. And, I think that's how, really, I think this is really an English thing. I think it's this idea that, these sports were really in the beginning were sort of the province of the upper class. And
it's participation, yeah.
Right. Well, but it was also like, yes, these are vigorous things that we're doing, but we're doing them as gentlemen and with honorable. And I think that persists because that here's the problem with kids: you have to teach sportsmanship. I mean, you don't want kids doing this kind of thing, But what we forget is that when you're talking about professional sports, we're sitting here in society watching these matches, and we operate in the world of laws. I mean, we have their laws. There are things you do not do. In that context. But in sports it's different because there are rules called rules for a reason, and there's a referee on the field for a reason, because there is a big gray area in which it's really open to interpretation of what's legal and what's not. And those judgments are made in the moment on the field. And what these captains understood, here's the thing, they never got in trouble off the field. They were not negative. They never broke the rules of society, but once they were on that pitch, they were operating in that context. And in that context, the great captains do not care how they're perceived. They do not care if people think they're, paragons of sportsmanship. I mean, Richie McCaw is such a great example of this because, he was, sin bin for 10 minutes, in the World Cup for tripping the Argentine captain, if you remember this. And, he was not really ashamed at all of what he did. I mean, he was famous for doing what Puyol did, which is understanding the tolerance of the referee and how far you can push it, and going right up to that line. And sometimes going over, and it's going to happen once in a while, but that willingness to go to that place where you can be criticized, where your sportsmanship, your character can be questioned. If you care about the team and the team outcome more than you care about yourself, you're going to go there. And if you don't, if you care more about yourself and how you're perceived than you care about the outcome, then you're not going to go there. And that is a huge point of differentiation, because if you're going to maintain a dynasty and win even when you shouldn't for a long time, you have to go to those extremes. You have to get into those margins, and that's what those captains did. But again, they never wanted to hurt anyone. I mean, they may have hurt some people along the way. They certainly did. But that was never the intention. The intention was to pull the team through.
Well, that leads me to another neat little segue. We're working well together here, Sam. So together each achieves more. So moving on to your third trait of a captain's leadership quality, leading from the back. You've mentioned there that these kind of captains don't care about what people think about them, and so subsequently they may bend those rules. But they also don't care about what people think of them from a media perspective. And I picked out a really good quote from none other than Roy Keane, who said, "The gap between what we do and feel and other people's reality is alarming. The media hero is not necessarily the man in here. Ditto the crowd pleaser. We live in a make-believe world created by the media, which is largely, though not entirely, fiction." Which is, in essence, these leaders do not care about the fame, the publicity. To some degree, and you can fill me in on the Timothy Duncan story, they don't really care about the money as such. They want to perform, they want to win, and to do that, they're going to be this personality that helps their team push through. They lead from the back.
That's exactly right, and that was so hard for me to understand. And you're right about Tim Duncan. I went straight to him when I started looking at this because he was the captain of the San Antonio Spurs, an NBA team, which I put in my all-time greats because of their incredible longevity. I mean, this is a team that made the playoffs 18 straight seasons, which has never been done. And they won 5 NBA titles, but they also had the highest long-term winning percentage in the history of the league. I mean, these are marks that will never be equal by anyone, I can guarantee it. And it started right when he showed up, and it ended when he left, and it's pretty uncanny. So, but Tim Duncan is the opposite of charismatic. I mean, he has the personality of a vacuum cleaner. I'm serious. His interviews, he's famous for this. They're terrible. I mean, he says nothing. He has this monotone. There's no emotion at all. People have called him the most boring superstar in the history of sports. I mean, and they're right. I mean, he's
so kind, eh?
Well, yeah, but some of them actually kind of meant it as a compliment in a funny way.
Fair enough.
He's so boring and just has no presence and had no interest. He's not interested in these accolades. There's a great photo of him, which is one of my all-time favorites. I show it to people. He won the Rookie of the Year award in the NBA when his first season, and they show a picture of him accepting the trophy with the commissioner of the NBA, who's in a suit, and he's wearing a ratty T-shirt and some old shorts, and the expression on his face is just one of pure misery. It's just, get me out. I want nothing to do with this. I don't want this award. And that's the mentality. So the thing about that is, you're right. I mean, they don't care. And, a lot of times it's to their detriment because I think the reporters don't like them and, are inclined to beat up on them when they make mistakes. Sometimes, people in higher up positions in a team think, I need someone who's really going to be like a good ambassador for the team. And, oftentimes they're not that person. And, that public perception is so powerful. I mean, I think it's hard to it's so hard to block it out when there's so much coverage and there's so many different people covering these teams and so much said and written about these athletes. It's so hard to be someone who doesn't enjoy that process or care about it. And it's a hard balance for a lot of captains to find. Not all of them do it very well. But again, it's counterintuitive, but you have to put that stuff aside. My thinking is, look, if you're winning, they'll find other people. There can be other people inside the dressing room who are great with the media and who really are colorful and will light up a room. It doesn't have to be the captain. It doesn't have to be the leader. And I think if a lot of managers and team executives understand that, I think it will free them up really to make better decisions about leadership.
You use that word counterintuitive, and when it comes to your next trait, I'm thinking about contradiction as another word here. When you talk about this next trait is practical communication, and one sentence I wrote down as I read it was publicly reserved but privately extrovert. Publicly reserved but privately extrovert. So you talk about captains who talk and really get conversation going. And I loved one quote that said that these kind of leaders, they circulate actively, engaging people in short, high-energy conversations. Great teams have a talkative culture, don't they?
They do, yeah, and that's where Tim Duncan, that was the second part of what I looked at with him, and as boring as he is and has lack of affect in public, he was completely different behind the scenes, and you would see his eyes always moving, always from teammate to teammate, and he's always looking at their body language and how they're carrying themselves. And the minute he knew that he needed to intervene or he needed to talk, they needed something, he would be over there and he would pull them aside and talk to them in very intensely. And it's an intense interaction. It's not, I'm lecturing you or I'm chewing you out. It's really, he tries to have a conversation. And, what I notice about that team, the Spurs, I've never seen a team that talks more than that. I mean, they talk all the time. They're all talking, on the bench, at practice, and in games on the floor, always talking. And that talkative culture is so important because, as I said, those problems don't fester. And everybody, knows that they need to deal with things in the moment, and it allows them to continue on and to move past difficulties. But even more than that, I think it makes everyone understand that this is a place where you're allowed to have your say, but you're also going to be held accountable for what you do immediately. And it's not going to be someone 2 weeks later is going to say, I didn't like what you, it's going to happen right there. And that talkative culture is very important. And it gets to conflict as well because, one of the things that these teams all had was they had a high level of internal conflict, and it wasn't, it was helpful. And, all the studies and the research about conflict and about communication say the same thing, which is that process conflict that's about the task at hand, that is crucial to achieving success and sustaining it. There is a kind of conflict that's always toxic, which is when it gets personal. And that's what was so brilliant about these captains and their communication style. It was never personal. I mean, they would go out of their way, to create conflict and to push back on things they didn't like. But they were also extremely careful not to single people out or to place blame or to say that anyone was deficient. It was talk about always the way forward. And one of my favorite examples of this was Philipp Lahm, the great German captain and Bayern captain, who, when the Bayern team was struggling and the board had just decided to bring in all these, expensive players that couldn't play together, they wouldn't listen to him. He wanted to talk to them and they wouldn't listen, so he went to the papers. And he gave this incredible interview where he just ripped cover off the team and dissected all of its problems. This is not done, especially in Germany where, the Bayern board is no one messes with the board there. And he did this, and it was amazing. And he was fined, the biggest fine that the Bundesliga's ever given out. It was a huge deal. But slowly but surely, they started to enact everything that he said. But if you read carefully the transcript of that interview, he never once places blame on anyone. In fact, he starts by saying, "Our coaches are up to the job. Our players are up to the job. This is a tactical problem." And that's genius. That's something that when we look at Roy Keane, and you look at Michael Jordan in the U.S., people that are often held up as archetypal team leaders, that was their weakness because they cut their teammates down in ways that were belittling, and they would make people feel personally hurt in their criticism, and that over time really tears the fabric of a team apart. And these captains, the ones that achieved this sort of elite status in my book, were the ones who never do that because they understood that over the long term that would destroy the team.
Well, you've moved along there to the sixth trait, which is the courage to stand apart, and everything you're saying there is neatly summed up. You have a great quote from Richard Hackman, who's an organisational psychologist, who said, "Leaders must operate at the margins of what members presently like and want, rather than at the centre of the collective consensus." So it's doing what, say, Philipp Lahm did there and actually taking a risk and doing something completely different just to shake things up, isn't it? And you also quote from, I think she's an organisational psychologist called Karen Jen, who talks about task versus personal conflict, that conflict can be really important for a team, and it's that captain who likely will shake things up, but their brilliance is to direct that conflict towards the task rather than being too personal with what they've got to say.
Right. No, it's a very difficult distinction to make, and those two forms of conflict can look very similar, almost identical. They're hard to identify. And my favorite example, and I used it in the book, was this Russian, the captain of the Soviet men's hockey team in the 1980s, this guy Valery Vasilyev, who was a defenseman, another, not superstar player. And there's this famous incident after they lost to the Americans in the Lake Placid Olympics. This huge humiliation for the Soviet Union, in the middle of the Cold War. And they were flying back on the team plane, and the coach, Viktor Tikhonov, had told the team, look, we lost as a team. This is a collective disaster. That's the story we're going to tell back in Moscow. But on the flight, surrounded by his assistants in the first-class cabin of this plane, he was telling a different story, singling out individual players and why they needed to go and how they contributed to the loss. And Vasilyev had overheard this, and Tikhonov didn't know that he was being overheard. And Vasilyev was really angry about this, and angry to the point where he did something amazing, which is he ran over and he grabbed Tikhonov by the neck, and he started shaking him and choking him, and said, "I will throw you out of this airplane right now if you don't take that back." And this was something that just stunned everyone. I mean, this has never been reported. I kind of dragged it out of his teammates. So they pulled him back to the back of the plane, and everyone thought, "Oh, he's going to Siberia. I mean, we'll never see him again, right? You don't do that." And that looked like what was that? If that's not personal conflict, what is? I mean, he tried to choke out his coach on the. So, but here's what the funny thing that happened was when he came to practice 2 days later. He walks in, and he's like, "Hey, coach. Hey, guys." Sits down, puts on his skates, grabs a stick, goes out on the ice to practice like nothing happened. And just he had clearly done this for a reason, and he was over it. He wasn't holding a grudge. So what's amazing is that the coach, Tikhonov, and all the Kremlin officials, everyone understood what had gone on, and he was not only elected captain, but they then went on to become the greatest hockey team of all time. And after that moment where they should have fallen apart by all rights. So we really held the team together. But what I realized is that was task conflict. That was process conflict. He understood that he had to do something to hold that team together at a time when it should have fallen apart. So it wasn't personal at all. It was all about, the team as a collective. And, that would be impossible. I don't understand how they were able to figure that out. Because to me, I would have thought that's personal conflict in the worst way and get rid of the guy. But it wasn't. I think they understood that, and that's one of the reasons they became so great.
It's certainly an extreme example, and it reminds me of perhaps less extreme examples, but the great work from Amy Edmondson, the Harvard psychology professor, and she talked about the importance of psychological safety within any group, and that psychological safety allows for robust conversation, if not a little bit of conflict, and how important that is for a team's success. And when the captain can bring that in, obviously you've given us a really extreme example there, but when a captain can drive that, that's so important. And just briefly returning to that practical communication, as you were talking, I was just thinking about when coaches talk, when coaches engage in a lot of controlled coaching, they rob players of the chance to talk. And so your book outlines and evidences further the importance of having that autonomy supportive coaching, whereby great teams are talkative teams. When coaches stop talking and they help players or give players the space to find their own solutions as individuals and as a group, they give those players opportunities to experience communicating. And that's so important. That can drive performance within a team because players become better talkers.
Right. No, it's absolutely right. I think that's something that's often overlooked. And one of the things that I've been talking to teams about since the book came out was another of Richard Hackman's teachings, which is that I thought was fascinating, which is in all his experience with teams, he realized that it didn't matter who performed the leadership functions, only that all the leadership functions inside a team were taken care of. whatever they were. As long as somebody took care of all of them, your team was going to perform well. And it doesn't always have to be the leader. The leader can do some of this. And look, the leader is ultimately responsible. I mean, the person who's going to run into that burning building no one else will go into, and they're going to do that thing no one else wants to do. But a lot of people can contribute. And I think that is, to me, the secret formula for doing this quickly, for turning a team culture around quickly. And, what I talk about often is you can be systematic as a coach about how your team leadership works. You can look at all you have to do is sit down and say, what are all the functions that are important in leadership inside this team? We need a spark plug. We need a mentor. We need a sheriff. We need a tactician. We need someone who is minding all of these functions. And then ask yourself, who's doing this? Who's doing each function? Are they doing it well? How important is that function? And if we lose this person or this person moves on to another team, do we have someone? Are we cultivating someone to step into that role? I think a great captain, as some of the captains that I've worked with, I've urged them to do this, which is to, be very critical of themselves and the functions, the communication, whatever it is that they're not able to do or they're not very good at, and to find someone inside that team to perform that function. And this is something a coach can do too. Make sure that you have, specifically told certain people who are good at certain things to perform that function on behalf of the team. So you can make this more of a collective effort, and you can shore up the weaknesses your captain may have that way. And that's so important because I think in an ideal world, the coach, the manager can worry about everything, like Ferguson said, every small detail of everything. But to understand that when that team is together competing, that it has its own leadership dynamic and structure, and that structure is strong, and that structure works, and that you don't need to interfere in that it will take care of itself. And making yourself redundant in that way and allowing the players to handle the communication, themselves. I mean, I think that is not something we condition coaches to do, or they necessarily think is a goal. But I think that ultimately, that's the way that you keep winning for a long time.
Now we're down to the last two traits, and this one, non-verbal displays, obviously is related to practical communication, but what you're arguing here is that some of the best captains of all time don't always need words to communicate. They can influence through their body language and through displays of emotion, because emotion transfers and emotion is contagious. And you talk about surface acting. What do you mean by that?
There's a lot of work that's been done about how people present themselves and about body language and what impact it has, especially when it comes from the leader of a team. And, it's incredibly important. And it's really about projecting the right emotions, about projecting those contagious emotions. And how you carry yourself and what you do in certain situations is so important because, as I said, there are only a few contagious behaviors and sources of emotion that are always helpful. It's relentlessness, toughness, and emotional control. And those are things that you can only show. You can't talk about that. You can't use words to get at those things. You have to show them. And what was amazing to me was, as humble and unassuming as some of these captains were in public or outside the confines of sports, they had a little bit of showmanship. I mean, they understood that there is an element there where you have to perform and you have to make the most of a situation, and especially with things like toughness. You don't get many opportunities to show that. But when you get one, you've got to make the most of it. You've really got to. People are going to be watching you when they know that you're injured or you're dealing with something or your toughness is being tested. And how you carry yourself in those moments is crucial because it is contagious. If you do it right, it has a positive contagious effect. If you do it badly, it has a negative contagious effect on the team. And those things add up over time. So, yeah, there's that showmanship. And, science has shown us that, we're all connected emotionally, and that our brains register strong emotion in other people before we're even aware that we're seeing it. And there's a strong linkage, and a great leader will understand that can be a powerful tool to move a team forward. If you can tap into that network, that unconscious network that runs on emotion, you can have a huge impact. And I don't think these captains you were reading, the double-blind, scientific studies coming out of, Cambridge or anything, they weren't, but they intuited that. And I think they understood that the things that they did in those crucial moments, not the things they said. Again, they didn't do speeches. The thing that they understood that what they did in those moments was important. And, it's an art. It's not something you can necessarily teach people, but I think if the instinct is there and the understanding of that, the power of nonverbal communication is there, then I think they'll figure out a way.
Now, often when I say to people who I've just met, I'm a sports psychologist, they'll say, you're the positive thinking guy. And I'm like, no. If we're going to use that term, then let's go down the path of flexible thinking guy. I'd like to think whether it's the flexibility of thinking, of emotions, of feelings, of behaviour. It's, for me, optimal performance is a consequence of flexibility with those thoughts, feelings and behaviours. And you've talked about the importance there of expressing emotion, but you also in the seventh trait talk about the importance of regulating emotion, and more often than not, when we think about regulating emotion, we talk about dampening down emotion. Yes, it can be bi-directional, but we're talking about here dampening down emotion. And you've got this compelling story about Rochelle Hawkes and Rick Charlesworth. The Australian Rick Charlesworth was the Australian hockey coach. Rochelle Hawkes was the Australian field hockey captain, and how she came into certain situations whereby she had to be really, really good at regulating her emotion, and that really impacted positively on her team.
Yeah, it's such a great story. I mean, poor Rochelle Hawkes. She went through quite an ordeal, I think, when she was with the Hockeyroos, this incredible team. I mean, this team, no one could beat him for 7 years, and she was the captain from the beginning. But Rick Charlesworth had some ideas which I think were grounded in smart things, but I think the execution was not great. He had this idea that naming a captain was destructive because it discouraged other people from taking leadership roles. And I can see why he would think that. I think the problem is that wasn't actually happening inside his own team, and usually that's a sign that you have the wrong captain. If people aren't stepping in and helping them, because a great captain wants help and will accept it and will not be begrudging of it. So, but what happened was he decided to have a leadership group. Rochelle Hawkes had been the captain. They won everything: Olympics, World Cups, championships, Grand Prix, everything. And he decided he wanted to have a leadership group. First, it was a small group of leaders, and then he widened it, and then he started rotating the captaincy. And then, she was at the end of her career, and she was going for, I think, her 4th Olympic gold medal, which was a record in Australia, in Sydney. And they came to the final match, and he announced the team captains, and she wasn't one of them. And this stunned her team. Even her teammates were stunned, that he didn't make her captain in her final match. And she is one of the most emotionally tough people I've ever seen. She went back to her room. She said, look, yes, of course I was crushed, by this. And she went back to her room, lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling for a while, but then she put on some music and she got her head around it. And she went in and she played brilliantly, and played incredibly well, and just shook that off and was able to put that behind her. Time and again, all of these captains had these situations that would have broken most of us, broken us into pieces. And they were able, what was shocking was they weren't just able to take those emotions and compartmentalize and put them aside, put them in a box and just say, I'll deal with that later. But they were actually hyper-focused. I mean, oftentimes when they were going through these things, they played even better than they usually did. I mean, they were better. They were more focused, more locked in. It's almost as if having the weight of that emotional difficulty building a wall between them made them even more intensely focused on their work. And that is an incredibly rare quality. I mean, it's something that you can develop over time, and scientists say, to some extent, it helps to have the right brain wiring, but anyone can get better at that, and anyone can be better at dealing with adversity. So that was one part of that emotional control. But, there was another part of it too, which, and I have to say something about Roy Keane here, because, Roy Keane is, to me, almost a tragic figure. I mean, he had so many incredible leadership qualities. I mean, really exceptional. And he just was missing one, and it was emotional control. He just wasn't able to shut it off. That rage that would bubble up, and it would, burst out on the pitch. It would hurt his team. And, then off the field, he would get in dust-ups at the pub, and he would, all these things that he did. And, the way that he went after his teammates when he was angry sometimes and kind of belittled them. All of that, was really, I think, the only reason that Manchester United team didn't make my final cut, because I think they had the talent and the ability to do it. I think a lot of it was that lack of emotional control kind of wore on everyone after a while, until the point where Ferguson finally decided they needed to part ways. But yeah, it's so important, and that's a good point you made at the beginning too. Emotion is so important. You have to be able to show it when it's helpful.
Yep.
To show joy, to show passion, commitment when it's helpful. But there are moments where that passion hurts your team and turns negative. And these captains had this switch, and they would just flip it, and they would never go there. I mean, they would just never. They knew, they could feel when it was creeping into negative territory, and they would stop. And that's the mark of greatness. And it's very subtle and hard and easy to miss and easy to forgive.
Absolutely, and it's interesting using the example of Roy Keane, and look, as a sports psychologist, you're ethically required. It's important to not make too many comments about an environment that you've not been into and can't evidence strictly. But what really resonates with me is that if you go back to Roy Keane's playing days, and Rio Ferdinand was in that squad, and Gary Neville was in that squad, and Paul Scholes, and these were uncompromising, relentless characters who would refuse to allow others to take their foot off the gas. And certainly Roy Keane possibly was a ringleader behind that. So there were enormous adaptive qualities that he had that would have driven the success that Manchester United did have at that time. And as you're outlining, it's so important for these captains to be able to manage their emotions at the crucial moments, at the acute performance moments. And when they do, then they become the real superstar captains, and they drive their team on even more, because they have that flexibility around emotion, that bi-directional quality where they turn up the volume of emotion and they can turn down the volume of emotion at will. And that is, that's a challenge to be able to, a challenging skill that a great captain has.
I love that you mentioned Neville and Ferdinand, and it gets to another point, I think, which is important for coaches, which is that there's a development aspect to this. And the Israeli military did this incredible study where they looked at their highest achieving platoons and their best leaders, and they found that leadership really had three components, and the first was just potential. A lot more people have the potential than you would think, but the second part is motivation. If you have the potential, you also need the motivation to lead in this way, because it's very hard work and it requires a lot of you. And if you've got those two things, then you're okay, but then you need development. And the development piece is what's really interesting. And, all these captains had a period of apprenticeship where they were able to learn and figure out their approach to leadership. And I noticed two cases. I mean, there were some where clearly they were able to model a very good leader and then improve on their strategy. But there were other cases where I think they learned in some ways in opposition to the captain they had, who was not a great captain. I think Keane is an interesting example because you talk about, you're right, a lot of, players I think had great leadership qualities, especially Gary Neville, who came out of that team, and they were able to see how great Roy Keane was in so many ways, but also the little ways that he undercut the whole thing. And, that sort of experience, that's what's important. And that's why I tell a lot of coaches that maybe their team is struggling, maybe they really want to start working on culture. You just have to bite the bullet. You just have to find one of these people, and you need to install them as your captain, even if it creates a lot of resentment, even if some people don't like it. Because the thing is, once you've done it, after a while, once you've showed what you value and people start to trust and appreciate that captain, the next person will have a model to follow, and that's how you build a culture. So you're right. I mean, it's such an important part, and I think that emotional control is one thing that we can all learn from, no matter what we do. It's so easy to lose control of your emotional self, and it's often forgiven. But if you want to be great, you can't.
Wow, fantastic! And taking you up on that notion of development piece. What I loved about this book is, yes, it's about leadership. Yes, it's about leadership within the captain's role. But so much of the book, and why I would urge people to read it, is so much of this book resonates for players of all ages across teams. Because even if you're not a leader or a natural leader, there's so many little psychological skills embedded into these leadership qualities that need to be developed no matter who you are. So it's a fantastic read in that respect. How can people find your work, Sam? How can people find you?
Well, I write a column for the Wall Street Journal on leadership, which is kind of a broad thing usually about business, but I do talk about sports there as well. Those are all, wherever you can find the Wall Street Journal. And, I'm as active as I can be on social media, Twitter, at Sam Walkers with an S, and sometimes post on LinkedIn. I kind of tend to flag things that I'm doing or things that I've written there. So that's a good way. I also have a website, which is called bysamwalker.com, which has a little bit more about the book and some of the responses and reviews and such. So I'd urge people to take a look at that.
Well, thanks so much, Sam, for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it, mate.
Thank you, Dan. It was great. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com. You can let me know what you think of the show. Be honest, be open, and if you've got any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. And remember, you can subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to be alerted about future episodes. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.